All right. I guess looks like we are ready to go. Thank you everyone for coming to the last seminar of the semester. It's been a great set of talks. And to finish, we invited Christian Rutz, who is a professor at St. Andrews University St. Andrews, professor of biology. So he's a very different, he brings with a very different perspective on what it means to behave from the perspective that we might have on our robots. So that's cool. And actually, he's spending a year now. He's local. He's at Harvard. He's a Radcliffe fellow, where he says that he's looking at blue sky ideas, kind of in a big brother scenario, enclosed in a building with 50 other people also looking at blue sky ideas, which is great. And one of the things that I wanted to mention about Christian is that we talked for a while, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago. We spent some time talking for a few months. And one of the things that got to me is that he was explaining sort of his experience of what it means to do research. He studies tool behavior in the animal world, and he's a specialist on crows, which means that it turns out that the special species of crows that have the particular behavior that he's interested in happen to live in islands that are in the middle of the ocean with very good weather, in New Caledonia and Hawaii. So he spent in the order of a few months every year having to go to these islands to study animal behavior and do experiments. He says that he cannot do that for as much as he used to do it, but he still goes between 2 or 3 weeks every year to each one of those islands, which is a very different perspective to what it means for us to do research sitting for 6 months in front of a computer and the other 6 months in front of the robot. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. It's a great honor to have you here. Please.
Thanks a lot, Alberto, and thank you very much for the kind invitation and the wonderful introduction. It's a real privilege to be here today and to tell you something about the research my group has been conducting over the past 15 years. We humans have evolved quite an extraordinary ability to make and use tools. Over the span of just a few million years, we've gone from knapping our first stone tools to crafting machines like the space shuttle. Modern humans have become entirely reliant on the use of tools. We wouldn't survive without the use of tools. If you just think about a day in your life, from dawn to dusk, we use tools all the time. I mean, some of the tools we use are very simple implements like a toothbrush or a pen. Others are exceedingly complex. Now, exactly how and why humans have become such master tool users is really an evolutionary puzzle. We don't quite know. And there are several research strategies you can pursue for getting answers to that puzzle. One is an archaeological approach. You can try and travel back in time and find out what our ancestors did. For example, you could uncover these stone tools and try and reconstruct our evolutionary past. Another approach is the comparative method of evolutionary biology, where you try to make careful comparisons across species to try and find common patterns, similarities and dissimilarities. And for that, in this case, you need other tool-using species. We know that we are not alone with this capacity to use tools. For a long time, we thought it's a uniquely human skill. About 50 years of research have convinced us otherwise. There are several other primate species that use tools. You see at the top a chimpanzee, our closest living relative. Capuchin monkeys use stone tools to crack open nuts. There's some birds. This is an Egyptian vulture that cracks ostrich eggs with stones. Some marine mammals use stones. This is a sea otter that hammers open shellfish with stones. Some dolphins use sponges to protect their noses during foraging. And surprisingly, there are even some invertebrate tool users. So this is no ordinary spider. This is a web casting spider. It doesn't attach its web to an environmental feature. It makes a nice little web and carries it around with itself and then actively casts it over unsuspecting prey, and that qualifies as tool use. But when you do a stock take and you look across the animal kingdom and you ask, how many tool users are there, you come up with a really small number. Only about 1 in 10,000 animal species is a natural tool user. And I think that raises two interesting questions. The first one is, why is tool use so rare? If it's good for us and our everyday experience tells us that using tools is a good thing, why don't more animal species do it? And the second puzzle really is, why are we humans so good at it? Some of the species I've showed to you in the previous slide, they use sticks and stones and pieces of leaf, but they do not build space shuttles. So there is a real difference that needs explaining. For the remainder of this talk, I would like to take you to the other side of the world, to a small island in the South Pacific called New Caledonia. This is the east coast of Australia. If you take a flight out from Sydney, a three and a half hour flight, it brings you to New Caledonia. The reason we go there is this bird. This is the New Caledonian crow. These birds look pretty similar to the crows we have here in North America, and actually the ones we have in the UK. But it's got a really curious foraging habit. Rather than using its bill, like other crows and other birds do, it uses pieces of plant material as tools to fish for grubs and things that are hiding in dead wood and vegetation. It actually manufactures some of its tools. It doesn't just pick up random twigs from the forest floor, it crafts its tools. Some of these tools have very complex shapes, and I will show you some examples of that. And there's some suggestion that they may be refining their technology over time to become increasingly more efficient and complex. And people have suggested these birds may have a rudimentary form of material culture. I want to show you what their tool behavior looks like. So this is a wild New Caledonian crow, and it goes hunting. It's looking for insect larvae. These are beetle larvae that live in deadwood. And by the way, if you wonder why you sit in this seminar, and if you wonder whether you're in the wrong seminar, just ask yourself what it would take to build a robot that would do what this bird is doing. So it's picking up a stick, and now it tries to engage the prey. So it's out of reach. It can't reach it with its bill, uses the stick. And what it does is it tries to tease the larva. These are the mouth parts of the larva. It tries to provoke a bite response, so it latches onto the tip of the stick and can be carefully drawn out of its burrow. We call this larva fishing. There is another crow having a close look. Again, it does this tickling. Now it bites on, and it gets a really nice, juicy reward. This behavior requires a fair amount of dexterity. It's not easy. And actually, we have a little tradition in my research group that visitors and team members have to try for themselves to forage like a crow, just with a stick. This is my PhD advisor, Alex Kasalnik. He visited 15 years ago when I set up the project, and we can have a look at how Alex fares. So he tries the larva tickling. Very patient. Words of encouragement if you listen carefully. And this really is not easy at all. And I have team members who have never managed this. I won't give names, but it's difficult. So these birds really need a fair amount of skill to get these grubs with tools. So one of the obvious questions, how do they know? Is it their genes? Is it hardwired? Is it written into their genetic code? Or do they have to learn, perhaps from parents or from other crows? So A few years ago, we were lucky when I was still based at Oxford that some of the New Caledonian crows we kept there started breeding. That was an unplanned opportunity, but we grabbed it and we realized if we have these chicks, we can do a nice little experiment. We had 4 chicks, all of them were hand-raised, so we were the human foster parents, and we split them into 2 groups. One treatment group we sent to school, so every day we would show to them how to use stick tools to get food out of holes and crevices, and they could observe us. The other group, our control group, really was the more interesting group in this experiment, because they never were allowed to observe any tool behavior, neither by us nor by other crows. So they were kept completely naive. And of course the big question was, would the naive crows that never saw any other organism use tools develop tool use? And this is one of them. We hid some pieces of meat between these crevices, and a few weeks after fledging, it's wielding its first stick tools, trying to get the food out, and actually manages. So this is a completely naive bird. These birds go through a really rigid developmental program that canalizes a strong interest in objects. They are obsessed with picking up sticks and handling sticks, and over time that develops into functional tool behavior. And you see this bird, this was its first successful extraction, and it's still clumsy. It's a baby, but it has already developed functional tool behavior at a very early age. So we know that there is a genetic component to it. If that is the case, then there are developmental adaptations. We may ask whether there are morphological adaptations as well. So if there was a long evolutionary history of selecting for this ontogenetic program, perhaps that changed the appearance of these birds as well. And you all know that one of the quintessential tool-related morphological adaptations in humans is our opposable thumb, right? That is what allows us to do precision grips. Of course, these birds, you've seen it in the video, they don't have hands, right? So they do everything with their bills. And we asked, is there anything related to their faces that is unusual? And we did some very quick experiments where we were hiding cameras in holes from which crows could extract food. And just this single image is enough to show you that these birds are actually quite unusual. The first thing you will notice is large forward-pointing eyes. It's quite unusual for a bird, actually. It's much more mammalian in appearance than bird-like. The other thing you notice is when it inserts the stick, it projects nicely forwards. You know, this tip of the stick appears to be right in front of its eyes. So that inspired a formal study. I want to just explain, before I show you the data, why I think this matters. So this is a New Caledonian crow in side view. When it holds a stick, they prefer to hold them in a transverse grip, so they rest the non-functional end of the tool against one cheek, presumably to stabilize the tool so it can't rotate. And actually, they're left-cheeked and right-cheeked crows, the same as we humans are left and right-handed. So that works really well, and you can see how the tool projects nicely forwards horizontally. That looks all good. This is a carrion crow. It's the UK equivalent of your North American crow. And it's got this decurved bill. If you imagine that trying to hold a tool, that wouldn't work well at all in terms of ergonomics. So the curvature in the bill would force the tool into a downward projection. Actually, the non-functional end would get dangerously close to the eye. That doesn't work. So we're pretty convinced that bill straightness is a tool-related adaptation. We were intrigued by the size of their eyes, and we decided to formally measure these birds' visual fields. So you can use a basic ophthalmoscopic technique to measure what the left eye can see, what the right eye can see, and what the area of binocular overlap is. And you can formally measure that. Imagine the crow's head inside the sphere with the bill tip pointing at this white symbol. And the red area here is the area, the field of binocular vision. That is what both eyes can see. We did that for non-tool using species for comparison. And it turns out the New Caledonian crow is really quite unusual in how wide this field of binocular vision is. Compare this to the carrion crow here, for example, or the raven. And when you plot it alongside the data that is available for all other bird species, it really is an outlier. So we have over 60 degrees of binocular overlap. These are the non-tool using species. These are all the other passerine and non-passerine birds that have been measured. And we argue that this unusual geometry of their visual fields is also a tool-related adaptation. So we have developmental and morphological adaptations that really points to a long history of being selected for a tool-using lifestyle. And that, of course, raises the question, what is happening on this island? Why in New Caledonia and not here in Boston? So in order to answer that, we have to go, as Alberto said, to New Caledonia to find out. Over the past 15 years, my team has set up 7 study sites, 3 in dry forest, 4 in rainforest, and we've got a nice little base camp halfway up the island. By Pacific standards, this is a large island, so the scale by here is 100 kilometers. This is what it looks like. Nice tropical island. But it comes with its own challenges. So imagine you try to follow a crow here in this sort of environment. Imagine you have a crow sitting somewhere up here making a really interesting tool. You don't stand a chance of seeing what's going on there. There are various ways of how you, as a field biologist, can tackle that challenge. One is this. You try to sneak up onto the birds and try and be invisible. Don't know whether you spotted him. This is Lucas. He's a former PhD student. We do that. We do that for playback experiments, but it's tedious. So another approach is to use nifty technology. And back in 2005, my team had a brainstorming session. We said, what do we ideally want? We want to see what the crow sees, right? So if we had some sort of crow cam we can attach to the animal, let it go, and then we get video footage back, a crow's eye view of tool making, that's what we wanted. And that's what we did, actually. So we developed tiny little crow cams. I've got one of them here. I know these days, about 15 years on, this is no longer impressive, right? We've got these cameras in our smartphones, but try to remember what cameras looked like in 2005. So these were really small cameras that were small enough to be carried by wild birds. We don't attach them to the head. They go onto the tail feathers. We push the camera head through the tail feathers. And so what we get is this underbelly view of the crow world. So when the crow bends forwards, nibbles a fruit, makes a tool, we see its head in camera view, which is very nice. We get the footage we want. This is the basic design of these units. We have a little timer in here, a microprocessor that allows us to duty cycle the units, switch it on and off following a pre-programmed schedule. We've got a little VHF radio tag, a recovery beacon. So once the unit falls off the crow, we can find it and then retrieve the footage from the micro SD card. I mentioned the duty cycling. Usually we give the bird a day or two to habituate to the new tag, and then we switch on the camera at intervals to sample its behavior over time. This is what it looks like on a bird. You see the tiny little camera head poking through here. They weigh about 13 grams. We can make them lighter. And they've got a camera yield, a video footage yield of up to 90 minutes. But in reality, we recover between about half an hour and just up to 1.5 hours. What we can do with this footage when we get it back is, because we have the radio tag in the camera, we can actually track the animal as it flies through the environment. So we get the spatial movements. This is when the camera switches on, so everything in red we have camera footage for. And we know when we, at the analysis stage, merge the data set that in this area of the forest, it was just foraging by bill, then there was a tool use episode, and so we can enrich this movement trajectory with this observational data. Most animal tracking studies, you may have heard of some, just give you dots on a map and say this is where my animal was, but you don't know what it's been doing there. Some clever tags use accelerometers, but still you need to validate that. Here we can link actual onboard footage to the locations. I want to show you what it looks like. So this is onboard with a wild New Caledonian crow. Remember, it's this underbelly view. Bird is flying. You see the two legs, left leg and right leg. There are two other crows in view. Now it's flying. The rattling you hear is the VHF alloy antenna. This is a young crow, I can tell, because it's begging, it wants food. And so the parent crow is preparing some food here and will feed the babies in a second. And this is not a gimmick. We don't do this to get a bit of footage for conference talks or for seminars like this. We deploy these units quantitatively in large numbers and then get really useful data back. So every column here is an individual crow. So I plotted data for 10 crows here. We can, from video footage, infer aspects of the precise location where they are foraging. We can look at what they do with their bills. We can look at what kinds of foods they get. And then importantly, we can get a handle on what kinds of food they get with tools and without tools. And for us, that really is gold dust. That's really difficult data to get through, for example, conventional observation with a pair of binoculars. So based on this data set, we can estimate that these birds spend about 3% of daylight hours foraging with tools, and that is about 20% of their foraging time. That's a really important statistic for us to understand the energetics of tool behavior. So I want to briefly talk about technological advancement. What I showed to you earlier was a very basic use of tools, like pick up a stick and get a grub. But these crows have a trick or two up their sleeve that is quite impressive. This is the oldest known human fishhook. When do you think humans invented fishhooks? Roughly. Are we talking millions of years, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds? Order of magnitude. Sorry? 10,000?
100,000.
More or less 100,000? Okay, it's in between. It's 23,000 years. Very recent. When you look at the archaeological record, when you talk to people who study technological evolution, they will identify hook innovation as one of the major transitions. Once we figured out how to make hooks, our tools really became more complex. It gave us access to larger prey, larger fish. It really drove further technological refinement. And that just happened 23,000 years ago. So in human generation times, that's 1,000 generations, right? So just think for a moment, our species went from like whittling little hooks like this out of seashell to building space shuttles in 1,000 generations. It's an evolutionary idling. And guess what? The New Caledonian crow is the only other species known on this planet that makes hooks naturally in the wild. Not even our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, do that. Only these birds. And that's one of these tools. And you see the tiny little hook here at the base. The birds make these hooks. These hooks are not a pre-existing feature of the plant material. They craft the hook, and I will show you how they do that. But I want to point out that this tool actually has two other design features. One is, you might see it's more light-colored here at the base than along the shaft. That's because the bird has stripped the bark, perhaps to reduce friction around the functional tip. You may also notice that the tool is not a straight stick, it's curved, and the birds actually bend them into that curved shape, and I will show you in a second why. Just want to show you how they make these tools, because it's really quite remarkable. What you will see here is a crow we have trapped in the wild, brought into one of our field aviaries, so it's temporarily captive, and after this experiment it was released again. And we know that birds in this population really like one particular plant species for making these tools. So we offered it a selection of stems. We've hidden prey here in these holes, little pieces of meat, and the crow knows that. And we've meticulously cleaned the aviary. There are no tools freely available. So we force the animal to make a tool to forage for these meat cubes. So crow goes, has a look at the stems, makes a really quick choice, really likes the stem on the left-hand side. So it's now harvesting raw material for tool manufacture. So it's happy with that stem. It goes to a manufacture log. This bit here, that becomes the hook. So the bird is very careful not to remove too much material there. This is a nodal joint, a natural branching joint in the plant, and it needs that wooden material to shape the hook. It gets rid of all the side branches and leaves. It doesn't need those. Again, think about your robots. How can a robot do this? Now it went back to the hook. This is what we call sculpting or crafting. It's trying to shape it. It just checked the ergonomic fit, wasn't quite happy, shortens it. You may have seen a bit of extrinsic dexterity there. Now it's hopping to the foraging log, and now it knows it's in business. It knows it has a good tool to work with. It's trying to hook out the meat cube. You can see the transverse grip, how it's holding the tool, almost gets it out, not quite. And now it actually switches strategy. It no longer hooks, it tries to stab, it tries to drive the tip of the tool through the meat cube. So when it extracts the bait, pay attention to how the tool skewers the meat cube. You'll see that in a second. Comes out, there it is. So it's like a Swiss Army knife. If the hooking doesn't work, use it for sparing. We wondered why these birds bother with making these hooks. You know, they have to source the right raw material. They spend several minutes crafting these hooks. Why do they do it? And we measured whether hooks boost foraging efficiency. Does it help to have a hook tool? And the answer is a resounding yes. So these are basically inverse Kaplan-Meier survival curves for prey. It basically shows you how fast prey is extracted. The steeper the curve, the faster. These are the hook tools, the blue ones, and the slope here is much shallower for the non-hook tools. So these are crows foraging either with tools, hooked or non-hooked, they have made themselves, or in a more controlled treatment, replica tools we supplied to standardize the tools a bit better. And it doesn't matter what we do, we get the effect. You know, hooks really matter, and actually, they can boost foraging efficiency depending on the circumstances by up to a factor of 10. You're 10 times faster with a stick that has a hook than a stick without a hook. So there really is a powerful driver for technological change, right? It affects energy intake rates. We then ask, okay, within the hook tools, does it matter how good the hook is? And the answer again is yes. So we measured lots of crow-made tools, and we measured what we call the hook depth. It basically measures how hooky the hook is and the outer length here. If we use the hook depth, it's plotted here, and this is extraction time, we find that the deeper the hook, the faster the extraction. So it not only matters whether you have a hook or not, but also how well formed that hook is. And I guess that is why these birds pay so much attention to that during the manufacture process. I told you that there is this peculiar shaft curvature, and we first thought maybe that's, maybe it's a coincidental thing, maybe it doesn't matter. But then we started seeing behavior like this. So this is a bird that just made a tool. Now it inserts it into a hole, not to forage, but just to hold it in place. And now it reshapes the shaft. This is not foraging, it just wants the shaft to be curved. Now it's happy. Again, some nice regrasping, and it's got a curved tool. Why do they do that? I told you about the visual fields. Let's plot what the left eye sees. This is what the right eye sees. We've got the field of binocular vision. If you imagine it used a straight tool, that would project to the margins of the field of binocular vision. This curving, this bending, brings it to the center of the field of binocular vision. So I think they do that to better see the tip. Okay, so there is this suggestion that these birds may cumulatively refine their technology, and I will explain that. So the idea is it all started off with just using simple sticks. Then there was some time in the evolutionary past, I don't know whether we are talking millions or hundreds of thousands of years or thousands of years, some clever crow invented the hook. So we have hook tools. There was an efficiency boost. Then there was the invention of the shaft curvature adjustment. Then the bark stripping. So you see how these tools become cumulatively more complex structurally, but also more efficient. Exactly the same way as we humans don't reinvent the wheel, right? We accumulate innovations over time, pass them across generations, and that allows us to build complex machines no single individual would be capable of building themselves. That's the idea of cumulative culture. So how do we know whether this operates in crows? We don't. We don't know how much of their knowledge is culturally transmitted. I told you they have some genetic predispositions. But we were curious to know how often these birds meet. Because if culture is involved, if social learning is involved, then that means birds must meet and observe each other, observe how they make tools. So we were interested in a social network approach. We had anecdotal observations like this one. So this marked crow is paying close attention to what this unmarked bird is doing. But again, these birds are difficult to observe. So we again resorted to developing some technology. This time, proximity loggers. These are basically little radio tags, clever radio tags, because they not only transmit radio signals, they also receive them. They are transceiver tags. So when two crows meet, the encounter is written into both of these tags' memory, and from the received signal strength, we can actually make inferences about how close these birds were. So if they were very close, RSSI will be larger than when they were further apart. And that matters because obviously to see tool manufacture, you need to be within a few meters, maybe 5 meters or so. Over distances of a few tens of meters, you couldn't see the details of manufacture. So we have an ability to subsample our data set. And we basically use these to construct a wireless sensor network. So we have the nodes on the crows, but then we also have fixed nodes, base stations, which we put up in the forest, and we use them for harvesting the data in near real time. And so we use a master node, go into the study site at night, so we don't disturb the social networks we want to study. We can check the programming on the crow tags, but we can also download the data from these base stations and then plot the networks on a day-by-day basis. We went through quite an elaborate calibration exercise. These birds forage on the grounds, they forage high up in trees, so we needed to see how that affects the transmission between tags, and we did a on the ground and high up in the tree condition across 5 different habitats we knew the birds were using in our study site. We then used actually our video camera data to weight the habitat information, came up with a master calibration fit that relates RSSI to distance. We have to invert that because we want to predict distance from recorded RSSI, and then we can interpret our field data. This is what it looks like on the crow. This time the tag is harness mounted on the back. It's a small tag, it's 10 grams, and they have a weak link harness, so the tag falls off after a few months. And then we get data like this. So this is a spring-embedded social network. So every node here is a crow. This is the demographic information, so circles are females. And then we have age information here. And it's spring-embedded, which means that we haven't produced the layout of these nodes. It minimizes the distance of the connections between them. And these connections are the social encounters, and they are color-coded according to the time 2 birds spend together in close proximity. And what is interesting is, when you look at this, there are clearly 2 communities. I just call them blue community and green community. There's structure in this population. We tagged an entire local population, so this is not a subsample. This is all birds living in one valley. And clearly they are structured. And then there is this young female, 32, who's friends with everybody. And we really don't understand why. We had a close look at her, and to us there's nothing special about her. But clearly she has a very central position in the network. When you look at where the blues and greens live in the forest, this is a map of the habitat. tick marks here are a kilometer. These are our base stations, which we use for harvesting the data, 40-something or so we deployed. You find that the blues live deep in the valley and the greens live at the mouth of the valley. We thought, okay, that's interesting. So these communities clearly don't like to interact. It was completely surprising. We thought over distances of a few hundred meters, every crow meets every other crow and everybody is happy family, but that clearly isn't the case. So we thought, okay, we can do an experiment. We try to bring them all together and make sure they are friends. So we offered them a tool use opportunity. I showed to you these grubs. They live in these pieces of dead wood like this. So we presented them like a dead tree right between these two ranges. So we moved about a ton of wood into the valley at night and thought, okay, now everybody will be friends. But not much happened to the network. We know that they discovered the food source, but they resisted the temptation to go there. It's like as if this is a patch of the forest where no crow must go. So we reversed the treatment, moved a ton of wood overnight from that location, split it into two piles, and put it into their respective core ranges, just to make sure that they really were interested in the food, and there were social reasons for why they didn't touch it. And this is when all hell broke loose within these communities, so they liked the foraging opportunity. We then gladly had time to reverse the treatment, and we could monitor how that network returned to its equilibrium state. This, to the best of my knowledge, was the first time that a wild animal network has been tracked in this way, dynamically, a time-ordered dynamic social network. And it's also, I think, one of the very first studies that experimentally manipulated the social network topology of wild animals. And we looked at various metrics, and you will be familiar with those, so degree, the number of friends you have, time in close association, proportion of time with close relatives, and you see that there is a strong experimental effect for both communities. We then use these dynamic networks to ask a simple question: how quickly can information spread in these networks? So if we take the empirically recorded, field-recorded networks, we simulated diffusion of information of those and said, okay, let's assume one crow has a clever idea. How quickly can that reach other members in the community? And again, you see a treatment effect. So during the second manipulation, the network lights up. That's when information spreads fast. Just want to show you what that looks like on an actual map. So this is our study site. This is like a very nice beach here. There's good snorkeling here. But this is the blue and the green community. And you see over the short range, these birds don't mix. We have other study areas nearby. These birds actually use different plant materials for making tools in a slightly different way. It's entirely unexpected for birds over ranges like this. We are talking a few kilometers distance as the crow flies. Okay, so I've told you a lot about New Caledonian crows, and you may say rightly, well, yeah, weird crows in New Caledonia. Haven't learned much, right? Sample size is 1, so that's a nice story you've told us. And I was wondering whether we can do better than that. So about 10 years into my New Caledonian crow project, I wondered whether there are undiscovered tool-using crow species. There are about 40 species of crows and ravens around the world. For many of those, we know hardly anything. They live in remote areas. We don't know how they forage. So it's entirely possible that they are undiscovered tool users. The question is, how do you identify suitable candidates? So there isn't enough money in the world to check all of them. Any ideas?
Well, I was going to ask one before you moved off the island. One question. Do they ever share the tools or save the tools or barter the tools?
Whether they...
Do they save their tools?
Yes.
And
yes, they do.
Do
they
share
look.
them with their friends and barter?
No, they don't. They look after their own tools very carefully, and they make sure they don't lose them. But other crows try to steal good tools. And there's no deliberate sharing, and there's not a shred of evidence for teaching. So parents have a very high tolerance of young crows. They allow young crows to come close and touch the tools and adopt the tools, but between adults, that's not allowed, from all we know. So how do you find the second tool user? Any ideas? Yeah.
Looking at the morphology.
Yeah, exactly. Straight bills. So that's our new Caledonian crow. That's the one I really liked after a quick Google image search and photos like this that came up. So this is a relatively straight bill. You see there's a modest amount of curvature. It's not quite as straight as the new Caledonian crow bill, but much straighter than most other crow bills. And surprise, surprise, they live in Hawaii. So another remote tropical island, and that was completely unplanned. It was beyond my control. But I think the plot is thickening with this, right? So there seems to be something unusual going on remote islands. And it turns out these birds use tools, so we predicted that they might be tool users, and they are. Sadly, the species, when we made this discovery, was extinct in the wild. So we did all the testing with birds that were held in captivity in 2 breeding facilities to produce young crows for a reintroduction program. But the good news is, I think there are now over 20 Hawaiian crows back in the wild, thanks to this program that is being run by San Diego Zoo Global. And what is really nice is when you do the phylogeny for the genus, you find that New Caledonian and Hawaiian crows are about as distantly related as is possible for 2 crow species. So their last common ancestor would have lived about 12 million years ago. So we are pretty confident that their tool behavior evolved convergently. It's not because it shared with a common ancestor. So in response, evolve convergently in response to similar environmental conditions, presumably. So I promised you brief answers to these 2 big questions. The first one was, why is tool use so rare? Well, there is something quite unusual in both New Caledonia and Hawaii. There is embedded prey, things that live like grubs and arthropod prey that live in dead wood behind bark. They occur pretty much everywhere, but what is unusual is there's nobody that eats it. There are no woodpeckers, there are no primates, there are no extractive foraging specialists. So these crows are effectively filling the woodpecker niche, but rather than using their bills for chiseling and hammering, they've evolved this tool behavior. There's another thing that is unusual. There are no major predators, things that want to eat crows. And I think that matters because when you think about this video I showed to you, how the bird made the hook tool, it's forced because it does everything with its bill into a head-down position, right? So it does the crafting, everything head down, when it uses the tool head down. That is incompatible with being vigilant, looking around for predators. If these birds had to worry about hawks sneaking up on them, they couldn't do that. When you look globally where these conditions co-occur, very few places, very few places. And it's unsurprising that these conditions occur on remote tropical islands, which usually are poorer in terms of functional diversity. So woodpeckers haven't made it there. Why are we humans so good at using tools? Well, I don't have a firm answer to that. So I told you we went from making our first fish hooks to building space shuttles in 1,000 generations. We really do not know how that worked. Cumulative cultural evolution is the strong candidate, our ability to accumulate innovations. What I would say as a summary of today's talk is that we have at least one species that seems to cumulatively improve its technology. And of course, this is sticks, it's not space shuttles, right? But the New Caledonian crow, from all we know, is the strongest contender for cumulative refinement of technology besides humans. So we have a really valuable study and research opportunity here. And one of the things Alberto mentioned, I'm looking at a few blue skies objectives. One of the things I'm doing at Radcliffe here at Harvard this year is I try to imagine how these tools may become more complex over time. I don't try to chart the entire path to crow space shuttles, but I want to think about how you could improve on this basic design. Is this really the end of the journey for these birds? I'm not so sure. Lessons learned from crows. So some of you may be skeptical and say, okay, that's crows, haven't really learned anything about humans. I want to give you one example. So whenever a new extinct hominin is being discovered and we have a fossil, people are excited about two parts of the fossil, the skeleton. One is the skull. They want to know how big the brain was, and the other is the hand skeleton. The reason for that is people want to know whether that extinct hominin was a tool user. And usually the assumption is you need a big brain like modern humans to make and use tools. And we can firmly reject that hypothesis. A brain the size of a walnut can produce what we think was one of the most important tool types in our own evolutionary history, the hook. Okay, I want to conclude here by thanking you again for the kind invitation. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.